Have you ever come out of a scientific meeting not knowing what the purpose was? Maybe the presenter said one thing, but the graphs said something different. Or maybe you didn't understand the graphs at all. Have you ever presented a graph which was really clear to you, but hard to explain to other people? Why didn't they get it? What could you have done differently? Distilling complex quantitative information into clear and easy-to-interpret visualizations can be daunting. Effective visual communication appears obvious, but creating it requires skill. To get it right, consider these 3 principles. Have a clear purpose, show the data clearly, and make the message obvious. These 3 principles correspond to the 3 main ingredients of any quantitative scientific work: purpose, clarity, and message. Have a clear purpose. What is the goal of your meeting? Who are the stakeholders? What question are you trying to answer? Be explicit about what you want to achieve. What is the purpose of a particular display? Is it to explore some data, to deliver a message, or support a decision? Carve out the scientific question you are trying to answer, ideally in discussion with partners, and write it down explicitly. Let this question determine what data to display and how. Show the data clearly. Simplify your graph as much as possible. Use less ink and more white space. Make the data stand out. And avoid unnecessary clutter. Symbols or colors, background, fonts, line styles, and annotations are noise unless they have a clear role. Less is more. The data presented and the choice of display should be necessary and sufficient to support the purpose. If you want your graph to speak for itself, make the message obvious. Tailor the graph to your audience. Choose a meaningful title. Minimize the viewer's eye movement. For example, to compare elements, place them next to each other. Place labels next to the data instead of in a legend. Exploit visual grouping to imply association. Use common shapes or colors, connecting lines, or bounding regions. Draw the viewer's attention to the main points. Add meaningful information as necessary through reference lines, benchmarks, or labels. All of these elements will make the message obvious. Now, think back to that ineffective meeting. How could it have turned out had you met purpose, clarity, and message beforehand? With the 3 principles of effective visual communication, you can become an expert at communicating quantitative information. Just remember, have a clear purpose, show the data clearly, and make the message obvious.
So welcome to this session on effective visual communication and good statistical graphics. What you've just seen is the latest output of an initiative that aims at improving the way we communicate visually, the way we do statistical graphs. If you like this video, which was actually finalized yesterday, you may want to grab a few copies of some other outputs of the same initiative, which are lying here on the desk after the session. With this, I want to welcome the 3 speakers: Allan Reese, Jennifer Rogers, who replaces Robert Cuffe, who cannot make it, and Andrew Wright, who will explore this theme of effective visual communication in 3 talks. I would like to ask you to hold your thoughts after the talks until the final panel discussion. We'll have about 20 minutes in the end, so any praise, any criticism, any questions hold them, and we'll have a lively discussion at the end. With that, I'd like to welcome Allan Reese. He writes a column in the journal Significance on good and bad graphics. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for choosing this session. Hope you made it enjoyable. Look at graphs has been my message for about 40 years now. It's something you might think, well, I already do. I've been using graphs ever since my school days. I understand graphs, I know what they're about, I've drawn them, I read them every day. Unfortunately, the message is often seen as, well, graphs can be understood at a glance, and Anthony Unwin has written in the June edition of Significance a letter that says this is a bad message because people think I have to glance at the graph and I'll understand it. This is a famous image which was first announced in April this year, and when it was announced, went round the world with great excitement, and the BBC, unfortunately not represented here today, went out on the street and they asked somebody, what do you think of this image? And they said, oh, I didn't think it'd be so colourful. Which is a very fair comment, because it's supposed to be a picture of a black hole. And in the BBC News and the newspapers that I read, nobody asked, what do the colours mean? So I've written about it in Significance in June, and you can read that if you're interested. Next example comes from the BBC programme Springwatch and concerns curlews, which breed across the UK, but they are in trouble. The numbers are declining. When I teach graphics, sometimes I get the students to look at one graph for 10 minutes or more at a time. Certainly not at a glance. But this one was introduced by Jan Williams on the Springwatch programme by saying it shows not just the decline of the bird, but the potential extinction. And the graph appeared on screen for 15 seconds. Handheld. Can you see the rate of decline? No, you can't. You can see the steepness of the line, but that's determined by the range of values which are plotted and by the aspect ratio of the graph. Right, did anyone spot the rate of decline? No, you had to read. I thought you put your hand up. you had to read the axes, which you probably didn't do in that 15 seconds. Happens in elite journals as well. This is another graph which went around the world and appeared in several journals. I first saw it in Nature, but this version comes from Physical Reviews. This is the graph that demonstrates that the Higgs boson exists. And a statist. Oops. Wrong button. Where am I going? Statisticians, you might share my doubts that a fitted line that suddenly deviates through 3 or 4 points is somehow dubious, but I'm not going to question the physics, otherwise the world might collapse. But I will question why they just labelled those values and didn't bother to label the reference value, about 126 gigaelectron volts, which is where they claim to have found the Higgs boson. Next example is more migrating birds. These are birds that you would see if you went to the south of Spain in autumn. Lots of birds accumulate through Spain, and when the winds are favourable, they cross from Spain into Africa. Now, if you just want to see the spectacle, you'd like to know which wind directions give you the best chances of seeing large numbers of birds. And here's another another graph from a peer-reviewed paper, so it's been scientifically certified. And this is the marginal distribution of modeled numbers against the wind direction on an east-west axis. So, hands up, who thinks they'll see more hawks on an easterly wind? Nobody? A couple. Hands up, who thinks they'll see more hawks on a westerly wind? More. So, Westerlies have it. Who'd see more hawks on a southerly wind? That's Hamlet. The person who said westerly wind, maybe you read my column when I wrote about this in February, October 2017, this one. The problem is that this is the resolved wind direction, so this is the westerly wind, but westerly winds are increasing plotted in that direction, which on any normal graph is towards the east. And conversely, easterly winds increase in that direction, which normally is to the west. I asked the author why he did this, and he said, well, I couldn't plot negative numbers to the right. We're not blameless at significance. This is the graph which went along with a commentary on the interest in bootstrapping since Efron published his paper in 1979. There's a problem there that clearly interest dropped off considerably. There's no mention of that in the caption to the graph or the article. Of course, it's because the number of citations have not been counted for those years, which are too close to the publication year of the article. I wonder why 2020 is labelled, that's a year in the future, and indeed why 1979, the year of publication, just gets ignored on the graph. What I want to do in this short talk is actually just to talk about labelling of axes. Why do people put particular values on, and often why haven't they changed them? You have got the power to change them. This example came from a web tutorial on the use of R. And it's explaining how you change the values on your axes. So the values here have been changed to 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 10. Very simple. And that's for the axis for y equals x. So why didn't they change the values on the x-axis? Doesn't make sense. This is the values for the line here, which are 10, 5, 3.3, and then they get muddled because they're virtually overlapping. That's the sort of thing that computer algorithms can't handle. They can't see that you can't see. So you have to look for that sort of thing and do something about it. For example, you could, if you wanted all those labels, have stepped them alternately left and right so that they remain readable. We might also note that that line is x equals 1, unlabeled, y equals 10. It's not y equals 1 upon x. It's y equals 10 upon x. One of my questions is, why don't people proofread graphs? So all those examples, what they have in common is The axis, ranges, and the choice of labels appear to have been chosen by software. Whoever produced the graph then didn't bother to change them, or in the case of the R example, they changed it to one axis but not on the other, because they were just doing it to show up the software. They weren't actually doing it to improve the graph. Choices do not seem to be affected by whether it's print or screen. In the presentations the last couple of days, I've seen many graphs appearing on screen which I can't read. And at a glance, I can't see what they're meant to say either. It comes back to clarity of presentation, having a message. Why are you showing the graph anyway? Is it just visual eye candy? Some of them look like Jackson Pollocks. And the question I just asked, does anyone proofread their graphs? I look at so many graphs in papers and come to the conclusion that where a misspelled word would be picked up instantly by a proofreader or by the author, something in the graph, does it matter? I hope it does. How were these people taught to draw their graphs? I think the answer is they probably weren't. I said you've been using graphs since you were at school. This is from last year's GCSE and A-level exam papers on statistics. And those are the graphs that they use. I think it's ever so quaint that they reproduce them as if they're drawn on good old-fashioned printed graph paper, where the values you've drawn along there, if you're drawing it by hand, are so that you can locate the points afterwards to put them on the graph. That's not what the person who's going to read a graph wants. It's like building a building and then leaving all the scaffolding around it. No, you don't want the scaffolding. You want decoration or information. Box plot is about 5 data values. I can't read any of those data values from that box plot. And there's 2 outliers. I can just question one of Marc's examples where the 3 drug effects were shown with more than 3 labels, none of which were the values that the drug produced. Why are we putting all these surplus labels onto graphs that don't give information? Those are ages of children. I don't know how they were calculated, but very often ages are in years and months. There are 12 months in a year, so quite difficult to plot 12 months on 10-spaced graph paper. Okay, you're probably fed up with me griping by now and want me to produce something that I've made, which I think is at least thoughtful. Whether you think it's better or not, it's up to you. These are arrival dates of swallows over a period of 130 years, and the data go from 1886 to 2017. And we do things like reducing the clutter by having, instead of 1920, 1940, 1960, which is just repetition, you can see better that this is 20, 40, 60, 80 out of 100 years. Have to mark the millennia. These are dates, so those are not arbitrary graph grid lines. That's the 15th of each month rather than the 15th and a half of April and it's 15th of April and 15th and a half of May. So you can see the months going up there, and we also got a count of days which starts at the 1st of March, because otherwise you've got a different count whether it's a leap year or an ordinary year. And I drew a number of those graphs and put them into small multiples in an array, and it was interesting that what came out of the analysis for any birdwatchers here is that the 3 hirundines, 2 martins, a swallow, all came out as having the same most effective model. There's a breakpoint in 1950, which was chosen by me. It's not an optimal breakpoint, so it's not exactly the same for each species, but it more or less works. And this is a graph which is going to appear in a printed paper. I've not yet seen the proofs to adjust any text on those, but I have made an adjustment so that I believe those dates are readable from the back of the room. And by having the same range of dates for each graph, you can see that sand martins arrive a little earlier on general than swallows, which in turn arrive earlier than house martins. And if I try to improve the graph for the hawks at Gibraltar, I can do various things. The labels on that graph were in speeds of meters per second. I have no idea what a wind of 2 meters a second feels like. I don't relate to that at all. I do know the Beaufort scale, which is not quite linear with speed, but I can mark appropriate values for Beaufort levels, and I can choose values on the grid lines, so you can see that from a moderate westerly to a moderate easterly, you roughly half the number of birds you're going to see. And it takes a fair amount of work to do that. It does require you to look at the graph and edit it, and then look again and keep on revising until you're happy with it. And I do it in Stata, which is command language, which means I can put things in and take them out. So the overall message from my talk is look at graphs, don't accept the defaults, make your own choices. It's a matter of choosing and designing. You can choose things like range, you can label important values rather than just a random ruler. You can add reference lines, you can put ticks and grid meanings so that people get further information as to what's the granularity of the data, etc. You can change labels from numbers into meaningful words. Don't put 0.0000000. Naught is naught. I've seen lots of graphs on the slides with vertical text. Horrible. And when you've done it, look again. It's an iterative process. I hope everyone, Marc is wanting to put me on.
Very much. Yeah, so I am Robert Cuffe for the next 15 minutes or so. If you enjoy the presentation, of course it was entirely on me. Any criticisms that you have, I'll make sure that Robert gets them. Okay, so as was said, I got these slides from Robert. This is a presentation that he was going to give. And he has done a little bit at looking at uncertainty and presenting a case study that was carried out by the Winton Group, so David Spiegelhalter's group at Cambridge. Now, some of you may have seen the Office of National Statistics. They started putting these uncertainty bounds on any of the results that they present. I'm seeing a few nods of heads. So what I'm going to be presenting today is a case study where they examine the understanding of these different types of uncertainty bounds with lay audiences. So this is it's migration data, so it's net migration over time, and they gave it to 1,000 different individuals. Each individual would get one of these plots, and then they were asked to answer various questions on them. So what are the different plots that we've got here? Well, this one is just the data with no uncertainty whatsoever. This one is the data with the 95% confidence interval fuzzed over it. This one here is the 30% confidence interval, the 60% confidence interval, and the 95% confidence interval separated in different bands of different colours. This fuzzy fan is this one with actually just then, rather than them being distinct bands, the bands have just been fuzzed a little bit. So they're pretty much the same, just with fuzziness. And then this is the probability density distribution around the sort of best estimate. So these are the different types that we've got. And as I said, there were 1,000 people, and each of them were given one of these. And then they asked them various questions about it. So the first question that they were asked was, they were asked to rank on a scale the ease of understanding. So it was a 7-point scale, and it went from very difficult to very easy, where 7 is very easy. I feel like I'm going to be under scrutiny here, because I'm putting up lots of plots, and I feel like every single plot's being scrutinized. But this is the point where I can say they were Robert's plots and not mine. So there we go. I'll make sure he gets any feedback. So as you can see here, people rated the plot that had no uncertainty whatsoever as typically being the easiest to understand. And they found that plots that had the uncertainty bands or fuzziness on them were actually less easy to understand. And that seems to be actually pretty consistent, depending on which of the uncertainty conditions we actually consider. They seem to find all of them less easy to understand than the control. However, it didn't really affect whether or not they could tell whether net migration went up or down between March 2014 and 2015. So here we've got whether or not they said correctly whether or not it went up or down, or whether or not they were incorrect. So they may not necessarily, they may say that they find the plots less easy to understand when they've got the uncertainty presented with them. However, it doesn't seem to affect their ability to actually correctly identify upwards or downward trends. They were then asked, was net migration higher in 2018 than it was in March 2017? Now, the correct answer is yes. And what we're looking for then is for a lot of people to be in these two categories here. So yes, definitely, or yes, probably. And if we look at this control, which is the one that doesn't have any uncertainty on it, we see, overall we see that most people are saying yes. Overall, yeah, most people are getting it right, that they can see that there was an increase in net migration. But what we're seeing here is that when you've got no uncertainty, we're seeing a higher proportion of people saying yes, definitely, as opposed to yes, probably. As soon as you start putting these confidence bands on it, and you start showing the uncertainty, we're seeing that there's slightly more people now saying yes, probably, as opposed to yes, definitely. So there's that sort of uncertainty is feeding through. Participants were also asked to look at a particular estimate. So for March 2016, how high do you think the actual number for net migration might be? And so we can see that for those where there are no uncertainty bounds, we're seeing a lower number for what the net migration might be compared to those that showed the uncertainty. So where you're showing the uncertainty, it does seem that people are understanding the fact that it's representing a value that it could possibly be. Yes, we have this best estimate, but the confidence bound is giving us some sort of indication as to what the net migration might be. We can see that where we've got the error bars or the fan, so the error bar, remember, was just that one that had the estimate and the 95% confidence interval, and the fan was the one that had the very distinct bands for the 30, 60, 95. They get a little bit higher upper bounds than they do if you use the fuzzy charts. So this fuzzy one here, which is the probability density function around it, that one, has lower than the others. And when they were asked, how much would you say net migration has varied over the timeline shown, when they were asked whether or not there was perceived uncertainty of the net migration data, very certain, it's very uncertain. So how much uncertainty do you think there is about these net migration estimates? Whether or not uncertainty was shown didn't seem to affect how much uncertainty they thought there was around these figures. So I guess that kind of leads us on to the question of, is it actually, should we be focusing all our attention on ways in which we communicate uncertainty, or actually should we be doing a better job of telling a story of what's going on? So there is an example of, on the ONS website, where they look at this net migration in more detail. So we can just present net migration with different levels of uncertainty, but actually can we try and look in more detail about why there is that uncertainty, why there is the variability on it. So here we can just split out, so this is the net migration, which was the figures that we were seeing overall, and we can actually have a look at that broken down by the immigration and the emigration. So we, again, they're all with the fuzzy plots. But we can see that a lot of the change in net migration is really being driven by the change in immigration. But just plotting this immigration on its own, well, that's actually masking opposing trends for EU versus non-EU. So actually we can take that immigration and we can split that down and we can say, okay, what is the immigration for EU versus non-EU, and we can see that, so this is when we had the EU referendum. So following the EU referendum, immigration from the EU is actually decreased quite a lot, and immigration from non-EU is increasing. We can also then split this down by looking at the EU fall being driven by migration for work. So if we look at those the EU immigration by those who are looking for work and those who had a definite job, we can see that that's decreasing, and that drives the decrease in the overall EU immigration. And we can see here, you can see that there's a slight increase. There is an increase for the non-EU definite jobs, and that this one isn't really changing very much. But we can see that the decrease in immigration is being driven by EU looking for work. And we can actually look at this in more detail as well, comparing the national insurance numbers with the passenger survey and work visas, and we can gain more understanding as to what might be going on with this net migration and these immigration figures. So what Robert wanted to communicate is the fact that I think as statisticians we focus a lot on, how can we communicate uncertainty better? How can we be doing a better job? Where actually, is that what we should be doing? Should we be telling stories instead? Yes, there is uncertainty on the net migration, and yes, there is uncertainty on immigration levels, but that's not really telling us why there is necessarily uncertainty. We need to delve deeper into it, and actually, this study that they carried out, this case study, showed that people are dubious or know that there's uncertainty around the figures that we showed. Putting that on a plot just makes it a little bit more difficult for them to be able to read. But telling stories and going into more detail about why these things are happening, what are the drivers of them, is a lot more useful, and people, well, then maybe have a little bit more of an understanding of the numbers that they're seeing. Okay, thank you.
So as Marc said, I'm a statistician working at Novartis, and certainly I've been a statistician now for 20 years, mainly in the pharmaceutical industry, but before that in academia, and always though in the health sector. So what I'm going to talk about today is obviously got a heavy bias towards that sort of sector, but I hope that what I'm going to say is something that's applicable pretty much to anybody who works as a statistician. And that's kind of because it seems to me that one of the skills of the statistician, along with all the modelling and these sort of technical skills, is being able to communicate. Because ultimately, it doesn't matter how great your model is, how great your analysis is, if you can't communicate that result to someone else, it's probably wasting time. And certainly over the 20 years of my career, I think how we communicate has changed quite a lot. Certainly in the pharmaceutical industry, when I first joined, almost every statistical analysis was shown using a table. If we were to display data, it would be via listings of the data points. And I always found these very dry, very boring, not really kind of inspiring. And I think that's changed quite a lot. And certainly nowadays, as you can see in the conference here, there's a lot more graphical displays of data that grab your attention and say, and certainly the way in which the software packages have helped to manipulate these visualizations means that these graphics have become nicer, better, and maybe even more beautiful. I think the question is that really enough? Is a nice graph enough to have an impact? Does it really change your mind? Do you can see something in the conference and think, oh yeah, that I get, and I need to do something about it? And I think that's probably the next stage that we need to go to, because I'm not sure that we're there yet at this point. And that is really not just having graphs, but having graphs that really influence people. So maybe going back and saying, well, why do some of the graphs that we show not always influence? And I'm going to take this scenario that I know the best of, which is in terms of clinical trials. And if we kind of look at the process of how we get from the start to the end in the visualization, it's kind of a long process. I mean, it starts off very well, and maybe there's a team of a multidisciplinary team, and a clinician, a statistician, maybe 3 or 4 other people sitting down and saying, okay, what questions are we to answer here? Why do we need this clinical trial? And then the next stage would be to say, okay, well, let's translate these general questions into some very specific trial objectives. We would then design the trial based on these trial objectives. And in that part of that design of the trial, we'd be saying, oh, what do we want to measure on the patients? What is the data we want to collect? We then would say, okay, well, this is the data. How do we do that? Are we going to use a form or an electronic database or something like that? How are we going to collect this data? And once we collect that data, how are we going to database it? What does it look like? And then we realized, well, actually the database is fine, but it's not the way we want to analyze the data, so maybe we have to manipulate the data in different ways to get to the data sets that we need to analyze the data. And then finally we get to the point where we can actually do some statistical analysis and then present some results from this. Now this process can take a long time. I mean, obviously in the clinical trial world, this can take years, from the question at the beginning to the analysis at the end. But even in a more shortened format in other aspects of stats, it can still take some time to get from the start to the end. And I think what happens is this long process means that you kind of lose sight a little bit of why you're doing what you're doing in the first place. And a lot of the visualizations then tend to not reflect what you wanted to do, but reflect either the statistical analysis you've done or reflect a data set that you want to visualize and show. This kind of this bottom-up approach where you're going from the closest step gives visualizations that maybe are not so impactful. So I think there's a different way of doing it, and it's very simple and very obvious in some ways, but it's called question-based visualizations. So instead of just a visualization, it's question-based. And there's only really 2 steps to creating a question-based visualization. The first one, and probably the most important, is to explicitly identify the question you want to answer with this particular visualization. So not in general, but just, I have a visualization, I want to answer a particular question. What is that question? And then the second one is directly designing a visualization that answers that particular question. And there's 2 things that this does. The first one here is saying about, by writing down the question, you really clearly align with the people around you as to what you're doing here. I know I've been in situations where I've been in the meeting room where we've tried this out and we've all got in thinking we wanted the same things out of this research question. But then when you go around the table and ask everybody, you get 5 different answers about what we're trying to do here and what's the specific thing we're trying to answer with this. So by writing down the question, really understanding it, then you get alignment. That's how you can get this alignment. The second thing is, once you've done the visualization, if they truly are question-based, then it's very clear to people as to what the point of it is and why you're showing them this particular graph. So I'm going to show 3 examples of question-based visualization. Well, two examples, and just the last bit of talk on exploratory data analysis. And the first of these is something which I think is probably one of the worst parts of the pharmaceutical industry, is the way that we do study reports. For those of you who are not in the industry, what tends to happen is there is for every clinical trial, you have a report at the end where you might have a written part of that report, which talks about results and conclusions, and then you follow it up with a number of tables, listings, and figures which show the data and the graphs and the sources for your conclusions. Now, these tables, listings, and figures can go into the thousands of pages of pages, and it's certainly something that is impossible to actually read. So what I have is an example of a different way of doing those tables, listings, and figures. And that's something like this. So this would be a question-based visualization that answers one question. So just to kind of break it down, because obviously you can't see that first one, the thing that, probably the most different thing about this is the fact that the title is not a descriptive title. It's not saying this is a scatter plot of X, something of a bar chart of Y. It actually is telling you what question this whole visualization is trying to answer. So in this case, this visualization is trying to talk about whether this drug gives if there's any evidence of something called early onset neutropenia. So neutropenia is about having low neutrophils, and that would be a sign that your immune system is malfunctioning. So under the question, then you have here a very high-level view on, is there some signal that I need to worry about? Taking data from, for instance, adverse event data that the clinicians on the trials are observing, also taking data from the lab values that are being measured on the patients. Once you've seen, hey, there may be some signals, then the next plot here is something which is showing how do these patients who have the signals, how do they kind of fit with other patients in the trial who maybe didn't have the signals? Are they real outliers, or are they just kind of on the edge of a more worrying trend? And then thirdly and lastly, going into a more deeper level of granularity, then looking at the 3 patients that showed signals, having data here that shows a little bit about whether these are real or spurious things. So if a clinician were to look at a low neutrophil count, that in itself is not necessarily showing you that you have a compromised immune system. There are other things that fit together that bring this picture about whether this is an issue or not. So this is also on this graph. So why is this visualization a question-based visualization as opposed to any other thing? Well, I think there's kind of 4 aspects to it which I think make it different. The first one is about the title, as I said. It's explicitly saying the question of interest. The second thing is all the information you need to answer that question is on one page. So there's no need to look in lots of different places if you have a particular question. I know some people have said to me, well, I don't think you can answer everything on one page. No, I need more pages. To me, the question then is, are you really answering one question or are you answering many questions? Probably in that case, it's best to split this up into many questions and answer each one of them very focused in a very direct manner, because then you'll have a better impact with this. The third thing is combining different either listings or statistical analyses or summary descriptive statistics all together. If you're doing them because you want to answer this particular question, then putting them together makes a lot of sense, rather than having them in separate places for people to find. And then also, in the spirit of combining, it's also combining from a data point of view. So not just having a statistical analysis of one endpoint, for instance, because that's what your data set is. Bringing in data from many different domains that give you the full picture to answer that question is an attribute of these question-based visualization. So that was an example in a static report of a kind of dense plot that can add visualization to answer that particular question. But there are also examples here we have in interactive Shiny apps of having a question-based approach to the whole app itself. So here is an app that we developed for looking at just results from 3 different studies and just comparing these studies and comparing the drugs in these studies. So even on the home page or the open page, you can see here there's a theme about questions in terms of the sections in the middle here are question-based in themselves. So in the population header, you're really asking the question, what type of patients are in this trial? In the signs and symptoms, you're asking what's the effect of these drugs on signs and symptoms. And if we kind of dig into one of these categories, into like the disease characteristics, then the app, instead of showing you lots of graphs and tables and figures, starts off with saying, well, what question are you trying to answer here? You're interested in the population of these, comparing these populations, or what in particular are you interested in? A little, next level of granularity. And these questions are searchable, so you can search whichever question in the search box. But if you look at that first one of what is the distribution of disease, a particular disease activity endpoint, then if you go into that, you get a visualization that directly answers that question. And here a box plot comparing this disease activity endpoint to 3 different trials. Now, of course, there's no reason why it should be just one plot. It may be a number of plots you need to put together to answer that question. And maybe there are different levels of granularity. So here, maybe we want to look at quite a few different disease activity endpoints that we're measuring on these patients. And we have, let's say, I think 7 endpoints here. On the left-hand side, a heat map to give you like an overview. Is there some correlations going on here? And then on the right-hand side, well, if you were to click on one of the pairs, if you're interested in one of the pairs on the left-hand side, then on the right-hand side, the scatter plot for that particular pair can show up. So here's, as an example of how you can use the question-based approach as the structure for a website. Finally, just a quick word on exploratory data analysis. I think it's also fair to say that people think that having kind of predefining a question for an exploratory analysis is somewhat counterintuitive. The idea is that I need to see the data to work out what I need to get from it. Sort of thing. But I actually think that the opposite is true. I think when we as statisticians look at a data set, we always have an initial question to start with. We then may do a visualization that answers that question, but that may trigger another question, which has another visualization, another question, another visualization. And suddenly you see that it becomes a framework for doing exploratory analysis, rather than just a random walk. It's kind of focused, and there is some ideas for why you want to do that. So hopefully I've just given you a kind of a quick rundown of why I think it's important that it's not just about visualizations, but it's about question-based visualizations. I think it's defining questions in the first place can really help teams align on what they want to do. And then once you have done that and you have visualizations that really focus on questions, they become very easy to understand, very clear and concise. And I think, from my mind, if you want to have an impact with your visualizations, then making them question-based will really help you, to communicate what you want to get across to your audience. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for the presentation. So I wanted to ask presenter on Organised data. What was the background of the 1,000 people sampled? Was it non-specialist people or was it statisticians? Who was the
Well, I
audience?
can't hear the question.
So I think the question is, for my presentation, what was the background of the people? Yeah, they were lay audiences. I'm not sure how they collected them. They came from a variety of backgrounds. So I think about, I've got the stats on my phone, but I think about 30% of them were educated to GCSE level. A certain other percentage, they span the whole sort of education spectrum. They weren't statisticians. It was intended to be lay audiences. Some of them may have had doctorates, but it would have been like in other subjects. I think it was about 0.9% of them had doctorates. Yeah.
So let's start with this gentleman, and please speak up. I don't think we have a microphone that we can pass around, so stand up, speak up.
I'll try to be very loud. Okay, so on the second talk, there was a bit where you showed the participants whether they saw the data was more or less uncertain because of their visualization. I'm wondering if that could be because people don't really have a good way to express uncertainty. Like if you ask a bunch of people, is this data uncertain or not? It seemed like that in the graphic you showed, basically everyone put the middle value.
Yeah, they didn't know.
Yes, so I'm wondering if there's a way for people to actually express uncertainty in a way that isn't sort of as vague as it seems like.
I mean, I don't know off the top of my head. I think it's a difficult thing. How do you, when you've got a time series like that, how do you try and express the uncertainty constantly through time? I mean, immediately I think graphically is the way to do it. It's whether or not we could be doing a better job of communicating the interpretation of those plots. You know, as you said, everybody just sort of said, I don't know if it's uncertain, I've got no idea. Is that, maybe just because we're not doing a good, we're investing quite a lot of time in the best way to express uncertainty, but we're not necessarily doing as good a job of communicating how to interpret to a lay audience. How would they interpret what it is that they're seeing?